Hello everyone, Ben Sumner here. In this video I'm going to be introducing you guys to a wonderful program named Nuke. This program is similar in nature to programs like After Effects or any visual effects suite, Fusion if anyone's used to that, or Autodesk Composite or Toxic, whatever it's named now. These are all compositing softwares which are made for layering multiple different video elements together and adding various other effects to things. Now Nuke is a bit different from After Effects if you're used to that, in that After Effects deals with footage in multiple layers. Nuke is what's known as a node-based compositor. So to give you a brief example of node-based and how confusing that might look initially, this is sort of a random shot actually of a demon effect that I was working on. Unfinished, random weirdness, but something to change my lovable face there into a creepy looking demon guy. But suffice to say, you can see all of these little squares are called nodes, and they're all sort of hooked into each other, very much like a circuit board or something of that nature. So it's a very logical approach to combining video, but it's not necessarily going to be the easiest approach for you if you're used to something layer-based, for example traditional animation, in which you would actually have layers of paper or film layering on top of each other. That's sort of what the layer-based approach is based on, and that can be a little easier to approach for some people than this is. So and I'm not going to say one is better than the other. There's a lot of people in both camps who are going to claim their software is better, and it's simply a matter of what you want to use. So Nuke, as I said, is node-based, and well, let's start off from the very beginning here. If you've never opened Nuke before, you're going to see a couple things here. Let me sort of work our way through the user interface. So right here, obviously, this is where your image will show up. This is referred to as the viewer, or the viewer panel, or yeah, this is your main view. This is where you actually see your image. You can see we've got a bunch of different information around here. We can see information about the type of image that we have here and what channels it has. I'll get into channels later. The X and Y position of my cursor. You can see color values moving for wherever my cursor is over the image, including showing a little color preview, and we get some more color information over there. You can see on the top here we have a bunch of viewer controls. We have this would be your f-stop or your exposure adjustment. This is only for the viewer. This isn't actually adjusting the image, but it is adjusting your preview of the image. But whatever you change here is not how it will actually export, so just know that. And then we have a gamma adjustment. This is very handy for, just checking to make sure your composite sort of say you're layering some CG element over a background, and you want to make sure that the black levels are the same on both, and the white levels, your gamma preview will really help you adjust that. And you have a bunch of other settings over here, which I'll get into later. These are sort of just viewer optimization, pausing your viewer, and things of that nature, just sort of viewer controls. Up here on the top you have some settings for what channels you want to view. I'll get into that later. You have different A and B inputs, and you can wipe between them. I'll get into that later. You've got a specific view number. Say you want to go directly to 1:1 scale zoom, you can tap that, and you can see they all have keyboard shortcuts here. For example, Alt-1 will automatically zoom to full size. You have some controls here for switching between your 2D views and one of your many 3D viewpoints. And a few other settings here which I'll get into later once we get into the 3D workflow inside of Nuke. Up here, obviously, you've got your very standard menu bar for saving, opening. You can save layouts. All of this stuff we'll be getting into at a later date. And then over here on the left, you have what's called the, I believe, the node panel, or the, actually see what the official name of that is, nodes. Okay, so this pane is actually just called nodes. But this is where you'll go in to actually create one of these little boxes down here, which are referred to as nodes. A node can be anything. It can be your input image, it can be a blur effect. You can think of these in After Effects. This would be the many different effects that you have stacked on an image, or the image itself would be a node. The actual action of combining one thing over another thing is a node. Pretty much everything you do in Nuke, or in really any node-based compositing, is going to be through nodes, as would make sense. Right here you've got your time slider, which I can't do much sliding right now because I'm actually reading a pretty heavy scene, so it's going to have to do some 3D rendering every time I move this time slider around, so give it just a moment here. And there it goes. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, let me just sort of view the. Oh, that's a unwrap of my face. A long story there. Okay, so you've got your time slider. You can just click and drag on this to move throughout the time. And you might get a little confused. You'll notice if you sort of drag to the left and right that you get kind of a glitchy dragging through outside of the range that you originally saw. I'll get into controlling this time slider a bit later because it can be a bit clunky sometimes. You have your frames per second control here. You've got your standard play controls, back to the beginning, back to your previous keyframe on whatever you're currently looking at. Play backwards, step backwards, this is all pretty self-explanatory. This lets you jump forward a specific number of frames. You can type in whatever number you need there, and you can. This is very handy if you're rotoscoping and you need to say, quickly hop forward 10 frames and put a keyframe, 10 frames, put a keyframe, and then work your way in between. And then you can set your actual playback frame rate here. Okay, so now the next area over here is this properties panel, which is currently empty. The properties panel shows the settings for whatever node you currently have selected. So if I double click will open up the properties for a node. So I'm going to double click on my image node here, and we have a bunch of settings for how it's reading in that image. I can tell it to read it in completely raw data, which gives it a different color space, all sorts of stuff. I'll get into color space as well at a later date. But yeah, so that's our sort of base setup here. So we've gone over the node graph, we've gone over the properties bin. Something to note for the properties bin, it can hold settings for multiple different nodes at once. So if I double click on another node here and another node, you'll see all these settings sort of stack up together here, and this can get cluttered really quick. So a quick way to cut that down, this number up here on the top controls how many properties bins you can see at a time. These are called property panels. This is the property bin, the whole thing together. But say I only want to have 2 objects in my properties panel, or my properties bin. I just hit enter after I change that number, and it'll get rid of anything more than that. So if I now double click on blur, oops, that's what I already had open. If I now open up this erode, you can see it dumped the bottom settings off. So it always keeps only 2 items in view. So that can be extremely handy to stop yourself from getting terribly confused. And there are certain nodes that will show on-screen controls whenever their property bin is open, and sometimes having multiple ones of those open can get confusing really quick because you'll be mixing up the handles for different things. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start a new scene here, and I'm going to show you guys pretty much what the workflow is. But first, I'm going to make sure that I'm in a folder for my footage that I want to use for this. Okay, so what you're going to do is just hit File, New, and oops, let me switch my layout here. You won't have to do this, but I've got a sort of dual monitor setup here, so it opens in a layout I've specified for that. But for these videos, of course, I'll be doing single monitor. And you'll see it opens up a new window. If you want to close out your old one, just close it out. And just it asks if I want to save. I'm going to hit no. One thing that's wonderful about Nuke is that it auto-saves like amazingly well. As long as there's space on your drive, you will almost never lose more than 5 minutes of work at the most. Typically I'll never lose even 10 seconds of work. So that's extremely nice. Okay, so the first thing you need to do whenever you open up a new Nuke script or a Nuke tree or a Nuke project, whatever you want to call it, is set up some of your project settings. You can see right now when you open it up, the default setting for a project is 2K Super 35. This is really a format that's best for working with film scans. typically I'm working in HD or something along those lines, and so I need to switch my settings to HD. Well, how you get to your project settings, you can either go to Edit, Project Settings, and you can see it's got a shortcut S. But be forewarned, if your mouse is in the wrong place when you use that keyboard shortcut, it won't open up your project settings. Basically, you want your mouse to be over the node graph down here, and then you can hit S, and it will open the project settings. Or, of course, you can just choose it here, and it will open your project settings in the Properties bin. Okay, and we have a bunch of settings here. The first one we're going to want to change is this full-size format. Just click on that drop-down and choose HD. If you happen to be working in 720p or any other format, you can set up your own format for that. You'll see it doesn't have 720p actually in here by default, which is kind of surprising. So I'm just going to make a new format here, so let's just hit New. And if I wanted to make 720p, that would be 1280 by 720. And then I'd just give it a name, for example, HD 720p. And there you go. Just hit OK, and now you've got a setting for that, and your whole project is set to HD 720p. I'm actually going to set it back to 1080p, but I just wanted to show you how to create your own format. Okay, now you might want to give your project a name. This doesn't actually affect anything unless you're using variables in your write nodes, which we'll get into that if ever much later. But we'll go ahead and name this. We'll just say bin footage. I don't know what I'm going to do to this yet, so we'll see. Alright, and you can see you also have a frame range, 1 to 100 frames. We'll just go ahead and call that fine. One thing Nuke will do to try and help you out, the first footage that you bring in, it will automatically set your frame range to match that. So, for example, if I hit R while my mouse is over this node graph panel, we will see that footage I was just working on because I was just in that folder. But you can browse around and work your way to wherever you need to go to get your footage. But I'm actually going to grab this footage that I had right there, and you can see the frame rate on this is, or the frame range is 0 to 179. Now, take note, Nuke is not good at dealing with video files. It's not made for dealing with video files, it's made for dealing with frame sequences. It will read certain types of files, some AVI files will work, and some MOV files will work, but I highly recommend not using those formats at all. If you have to, honestly, this is where After Effects comes in handy. Import your footage there, export a sequence as a PNG sequence or a JPEG sequence or a DPX sequence. But basically, you should have a bunch of individual frame files, and Nuke by default will show it like this. It'll recognize that that's a sequence, and you can just open it up there. You just click it once to select it and hit open. Alright, so now we have our footage here, but we don't see anything. Why is that? Well, you'll notice there's one other node in our node graph, and that's called the viewer. The viewer is a very important node. It is what tells Nuke what you want to see up here in your actual viewer. So if I hook the viewer up to our footage here, you will see the footage. So, exactly as you'd expect. And also take note, Nuke went ahead and changed our frame range to match the first footage that I imported, so that's pretty cool. We're actually done with our project settings, so I'll go ahead and close that out. Alright, so we have our footage here, and I'm just going to press H to sort of fit. H, I believe, just stands for home, but that will just automatically fit the footage to whatever viewing area you have, and it will kind of set it to auto adjust whenever you resize this whole area. By the way, everything in Nuke is resizable, which you'd probably be used to if you're used to After Effects, or really most softwares at this point. Okay, so down here in the node view, first off I'll explain the controls. If you Alt click and drag, you will pan your view around. This is very handy if you have a ton of nodes and they can't all fit in the view at once. If you Alt middle mouse drag, you will zoom in, or you can also just use the scroll wheel by itself. And if you Alt right click, that'll also pan. I mean, there's really just pan and zoom are the only two controls in here. If you right click in the node view, you'll see that you have file. You get your menus from up here, and then you also below the file and edit, render, Basically, these first three items are sort of controls. Everything below that is actually going to create a node for you. For example, if I do image read, that's actually what we just did when we hit R to import another footage. So I could do that and import another sequence. Or if you right click, we can go to, let's do something simple. Let's go to color and make a grade node. And you want to get used to the keyboard shortcuts on here. Grade is something you're going to be using constantly, and the keyboard shortcut for that is G. Now bear in mind, most of these keyboard shortcuts only work while your mouse is over this node graph area. But let's just go ahead and hit G. That'll create the node. And this can also be found up here in this menu. I believe it's this menu right here, the little pie chart there. These used to be colored, which actually made them a lot easier to recognize, in my opinion, but now they've gone with a grayscale. But you can just mouse down to grade there, and you can see it also shows that. So there's really three ways to create any node. You can create them from the menus over here, from the right-click menus, or you can hit their keyboard shortcut if they have one. And there's actually a fourth way to make any node, and this becomes very handy if you don't know the keyboard shortcut for something, or if it doesn't have one. You can just type in tab while your mouse is over the node graph, and that will open up a node search. So I can type in something here, let's just say hue correct, and I can see it in the list, and you just click it and it'll create that node. I'm actually not going to use this, so I'm just going to click it to select it and hit delete. But that's a way that you can make your nodes. So say I wanted to do let's do a checkerboard. I would just type in checker, and there's the option for checkerboard, and I just click it or hit enter. And there you go. Alright, now this viewer thing, there's a very easy way to hook this viewer up to things. You don't always have to grab the top of this arrow and plug it in to the nodes. What you can actually do is click on the node that you want your viewer hooked up to. It'll be highlighted, and then press 1, and that will hook your viewer up to that. You can also do multiple inputs, so let's get over that here real quick. Mini nodes, you'll see they have sort of an arrow on the side here, and if you pull that out, you'll see what it's for. You can see the viewer node actually has a second input, and when I pull that out, it says 2. So this is actually a second input for the viewer, so I can actually have two things hooked up at once. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, if I mouse up to the viewer area here and I hit 1 and 2, I can quickly toggle between two different inputs. So that's very handy. Word of advice: you almost always want to grab an arrow from the tail end of the arrow is the easiest way. Sometimes you can grab things from the head, but it's typically easy to work your way backwards and plug things in where they go. Okay, so we have two things hooked up to our viewer now. Now I want to color grade this footage. So I'm going to grab that arrow and plug it into our footage. Okay. And now I don't need the second input on my viewer, so I'll go ahead and unplug that. And now I want to view this graded footage. So I'm just going to select it and press 1, and that'll move the first input for my viewer down there. And right now it's doing nothing because I have not set up any settings for this grade node. So let's just double click on that, and its settings will pop up here on the top. And now I can control any number of sliders here. For example, I can brighten it up with the gain. Gain and multiply are actually the exact same thing, but using them in tandem, having two different sliders for it actually lets you kind of control things a little better. I believe gain is applied before anything else, and then multiply is applied at the very end. That's not terribly important, but yeah. Okay, so we have our black point here, and you can see this footage came in extremely dark, and if I mouse over this, this is all actually solid black. So this is this image does have clamped color. Oh, and by the way, the controls for moving around the node view are the same for moving around the image up here in the viewport. So, control middle mouse, or just middle mouse to zoom, control middle mouse drag to zoom smoother, and control left or right mouse to pan your view. So, okay. So, for example, with black point here, if I drag black point down, it's going to lighten up this image substantially because I'm telling it that the black point is actually way below 0, and so it's sort of compressing the image to make up for that. And if I want my white point to be, say, way lower, that'll brighten the image. Default is 1 on that. Okay, and then your gamma, as most people know by now if you've messed with any VFX software or any editing software, that's your midtones. So if I brighten that up, and this is not great footage, so you can see it's very compressed looking and just lossy, very, very lossy. Okay, so let's just sort of cut me out and put me over this checkerboard. That's a very simple beginning task. So we will do that. Alright, so I'm just going to delete this grade node. We don't actually need that for what we're doing. And just get in the habit of hooking your viewer up to whatever you're working on. So just click a node and press 1. That's a habit you'll want to get into. Click, press 1, click 1, click 1. If you need 2 inputs, click 2, and now you can toggle between them when your mouse is up here by pressing 1 and 2. Or as long as you have no node selected at the time, it'll also toggle even if your mouse is down here. But the moment you select a new node and press an input, it'll move. So now I've got both inputs on the checkerboard, which is pretty much useless to do. But okay, so we're going to put our viewer on my original footage here, and I'm just going to do a single frame to put me over the background. Alright, I'm going to use a keyer node and use that in tandem with a roto node. So the keyer node, if we click on this image and press tab and type in keyer, the keyer node lets you do quite a few different keying tasks. It's not the most robust one, but for simple keying tasks this is a very easy tool to use. You can see by default this is set to Luminance key. So what this is going to do is it's going to try and create an alpha channel, which is your transparency channel. Well, they aren't exactly the same, but you can think of it that way. Matching the brightness values of this image, which look like this. So as you probably know, every image is made up of red, green, blue, and in this case we have another channel called alpha, and that alpha channel is what we later use to layer things over each other. You never actually deal with transparency in Nuke. You never deal with that. It's a matter of cutting out color with your alpha channel and layering something else over that, which is really what After Effects is doing behind the scenes too. They just try and make it very simple for you by calling it transparency, and you just never deal with an alpha channel independently, or hardly ever. Anyway, if we mouse over our viewer, you can actually switch between the different channels that you're viewing. You can isolate just a single channel by pressing R, G, B, or also A. And right now you'll see A is matching sort of the brightness values of my image, and that's because this keyer, this luminance keyer, has literally done just that. It's done a luminance key, and so the bright values, the brightest pixels of that original image, are going to be white, and the darkest values are going to be black. So you basically get just a black and white image of what you had before. Now this ramp here, this lets you sort of clamp the areas that you want. Well, I'll demonstrate it quick and then explain it. Basically, you get to clamp your values up or down to tell it what you want to be in your alpha channel. So if you drag this top part over, you're going to be clamping your white. So essentially what you want is you're just trying to isolate a silhouette here. And for me, obviously I've got brighter portions of my head that aren't going to work out so well. We'll deal with those in a bit, but the general silhouette of me is actually quite good from this luminance keyer. So I'm just going to clamp this down until we get a nice alpha. And basically what we want to do is get rid of any gradient here. So, and I could later manually cut this area out with a roto shape, but for the sake of simplicity here, we're going to kind of over clamp most of our image. Well, I don't have to clamp it that much. Alright, we'll go with this. That's pretty good. Okay, so you can see we have black and white. Now, bear in mind, whenever you actually layer the things together with what's called a merge, the white areas are the equivalent of what would be in Photoshop fully opaque. So really this is an inverse image of what we want. This would be keeping just the background and getting rid of most of the foreground. So we need to invert this. We could go ahead and actually add just a separate invert node, but we're not going to do that because this keyer node knows that very often you'll just need to do that, and so they have an invert option right here. So you can just check that, and there you go. Now we have white on black, and now the white areas of the alpha channel will be solid opaque when we layer it over the background. Okay, so there's only a few areas that we need to tweak here, and those would be the darker black areas on my face, and the way we're going to tackle that is with a roto shape. And then also we'll have to get rid of these sort of white fringes on the image because we don't want those being kept. So to do this, all we have to do, well, first off, I'm going to go back to my color channel, and to do that, to see the full color image, you have to just hit whatever channel you're currently on again, hit that key again. So for example, right now I'm on the alpha channel, which I hit A to view, and if I hit A again, I'll go right back to the full color image. Same with red. If I hit red again, I'll go back to the full color image. Same with green. If I hit G twice, it'll toggle between them, and same with B. So that's how you sort of switch what channel you're looking at. And you'll notice too, this little drop down changes whenever you toggle, so you can actually switch it right up here. And there's another view actually called matte overlay, and what that does is it displays red over your image wherever you have white in the alpha channel. This is very similar to what Photoshop has whenever you're dealing with actual alpha channels in Photoshop. You can, if you turn on the viewing of the alpha channel, you'll see something very similar to this. We're going to go back to the RGB view, and actually no, we need to view the alpha, sorry. Alright, so we're on the alpha channel, we've got this node selected, and by the way, whenever you create a new node, if you have something selected already, it'll create it right after that in the chain. If you don't, it's just going to create it out here in the middle of nowhere. So for example, the keyboard shortcut to make a roto node is O. If you don't want to do it that way, let's just delete that. You can right click and you can do draw roto. Or you can come up here and do draw roto. Or you can hit tab and hit roto and hit enter. And it creates them all over there. But if I click off of that previous node and hit O, you'll see it just creates it out here in the middle of nowhere. To easily connect this in, you can actually just drag it right into this chain, and it'll just insert itself between the Luminance key and our viewer here. Or you can manually connect it yourself and move the viewer to look at our roto. You'll get the same result. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and do some roto. Alright, so the roto node has been rewritten, I think, twice now, and it's actually now pretty simple to use. When you first open it up, you're going to see you have a bunch of different tabs here. You have transform tabs, which sort of universally let you just translate your shapes or groups of shapes. You've got the shape tab itself, which has settings for the individual shape that you have selected. That lets you set the color, whether or not it should be showing motion blur, and then controls for the motion blur. You have a lifetime, which tells it which frames to be visible, so you can simply just cut a roto shape, make it disappear after a few frames, rather than having to slide it off frame or something, which can also wreak havoc if you have motion blur on too. But the main node we're going to be working in here is the roto node. Now you'll see by default it says roto output alpha. So that means if I draw a big old shape over this, it's not going to be putting white in the color, it's just going to be putting white in the alpha channel. So, for example, if I go back to my color view here by tapping A again, you can just start clicking, and you'll see when you click and drag, you pull out these handles. If you've done rotoing in any other program, that should look familiar. These are called Bezier handles, or Bezier handles, depending on who you talk to. It is Bezier, but I've heard people say it both ways. And then you can just click these shapes. Obviously you want to work your way around and then eventually click on your first dot to close the shape. But you'll see this isn't showing anything up on the color channels. It's only when I go to my alpha channel that I can see what it's doing, and that's because this is just set to only affect the alpha channel. If I set this to RGBA, that means it's going to put it in the red, green, blue, and alpha channels. And now if I go back to my color, you can see we actually have white over the image here. But we don't want that. We actually just want it on the alpha, so I'll go ahead and set that back. That was just to show you guys that there. Now, I'm actually going to take this shape, and I want to make this shape black. I'm going to use this to cut out all this extra white junk on this side. So I'm going to go to the Shape tab. That's where I can control settings for this particular shape, and I'll drop this down to black, the color slider. You can also choose an individual color, which really only has an effect when you're putting it over the color channels of your image, but you can do that. And to hide this slider, you just hit the little color wheel button again. If you're on Nuke version 7 or anything prior to 8, basically, when you click this color wheel button, you'll actually get a separate window with the color wheels, which will look like this. But they've updated it recently so that it's in line with all the settings, which is really nice. But if you ever do want to see the separate window so you can have it over your image and adjust the bigger sliders, which can be a little more accurate, all you have to do is hold down Control and click on the color wheel. Okay, so we have this shape. It's black, and you can see if I move any of these points over my image, it blocks out that portion of the image. So we're just going to sort of tweak this shape. I didn't really draw it right for the purpose I needed it for, but we're just going to go ahead and drag this out to cover up all of these little white areas here that we don't need. And now I need another one over here, so I'm going to click right here on my toolbar to get the drawing tool again, and just draw another shape over that area. And you can see it starts out white by default, it always will, so I can just drag that down. Actually, that's not true. You can set your color initially right here. I would just drag everything to 0 on this, including the alpha channel, and then whenever I draw the shape, it will be black by default. So you can change it before you actually draw the shape. Alright, so now we actually want to draw a white shape to sort of fill in these darker holes in my face. So I'm going to click on the color wheel again here, and let's just drag these up to white, and I'll draw a white shape to fill in these holes. So I'm just going to sort of trace my edges here. And you know what, this tool with the Bezier handles and everything, I'm not a big fan of. I prefer to draw my shapes with what's called a B-spline tool, especially if it's for something organic like someone's face. So I'm going to hit Control-Z until all my points disappear, and then I'm going to click and hold on this tool, and I can actually choose B-spline. And actually, if you hit V multiple times, that'll cycle between the different tools as long as your mouse is over your viewer here. This one is your B-spline. It's the one that has a little dot and a 3 under the curve. And the way this one works, you won't have the tangent handles, but it's sort of automatically smoothed. And so to make up for not having tangent handles, you just draw a few more shapes or a few more dots to sort of control the edges. This is my preferred way of doing Roto for organic shapes, but everyone's got their own preferences. And actually here I was about to fill in a hole that's actually white areas of my, that's seeing the back wall through my hair, so I actually don't want to block that one out. That is a legitimate hole there. Okay, so we're going to work our way up. And you can cycle between your different channels the whole time you're drawing all you want to make sure you're getting the right shapes. And you can draw off of the canvas. Okay, just drawing a bunch of points here. Alright, I really have nothing else to draw over, so I could have just cut this over from here because everything else is already perfectly fine. But let's go ahead and just close that shape, and there you go. So now if we look at our alpha channel, and if we hit O while our mouse is in the viewer, it'll hide the overlays. So we can actually just take a look at our raw channel without all those shapes kind of cluttering up the viewport. If you hit O again, it'll show up. So there you go. By the way, one thing I didn't say while we're talking about O, if you notice the keyboard shortcut for the Roto shape down here is O. It creates a new Roto shape. And up here, the O keyboard shortcut will hide your overlay, so it very much matters where your mouse is. And also, if you accidentally press P instead of O, because they're right next to each other, you'll start editing things and you won't see anything happen. Like, for example, this shape didn't actually come out here and turn white, and that's because P pauses your viewer. So if ever you get confused, nothing's updating, you want to press this pause button or press P to toggle it. And down in the node graph, P will create a paint node, which we'll get into later. Okay, so we have a good alpha channel now. If we look at our color, the color's fine, it's as it was. And if we look at our alpha channel now, we've got a nice clean silhouette of me. Cool, so how do we layer that over the background? Well, we have to do what's called premultiplying. Now, I'll get into the math of premultiplying later, but you can just think of it as applying your alpha channel to your image such that when you layer things over, it acts as a transparency. This is what, again, Photoshop or After Effects all do for you, which is great, but it also does cut out a little bit of your control over how things are working. But suffice to say, the workflow in Nuke should always be get your color the way you like it, get your alpha the way you like it, and then the very last step before you layer things over each other is premultiply and emerge. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Our color's the way we like it, the alpha's the way we like it, so let's go ahead and click on this bottom node here, type tab, and type in premult. And you just get PREM and you'll see it show up. You can just click it there, and you'll see that actually cuts out the background. So you can see our alpha channel hasn't changed, it's still exactly the same, but our color channels now have black here. Bear in mind, this is not transparency, this is actually just black, the color black, or whatever you'd want to call it. It's just pixels that have black, and then the alpha channel also has black. The combination of those two things being true makes it so that when you merge A over B, you get this. If we didn't premult, you would get this, the background. Long story, we'll get into that later, but alright, so to do that merge, you select your premult and you just press M, or just like any other node, you could hit tab and type merge, and there it is, and that'll create the same node. So in Nuke, the workflow also is always A over B, or A affecting B. B is always sort of your base image, your ground proof image, or whatever you want to call it. So in this case, B would be the background, and you always want to pipe things into the B chain. That's the way to keep a very organized workflow here. Alright, so we have the image, it gets pre-multiplied, and then layered over this image. And there you go. We now have me over the background, and if I play forward a few frames, this might actually work. Obviously, I didn't animate my Roto shape to track with my face, so eventually this would cease to work. Uh-oh, and this is lagging actually due to the hard drive I'm running this footage off of is kind of terrible. So, and you can see the second that I move, that Roto shape becomes a problem because it's still sitting back where I was. But this does work for, well, kind of 2 frames. But yeah, so there you go. That is the final output here. And that is your introductory how to composite in Nuke. I know this took a way long time for such a simple task, but understand that's just because I was explaining how everything works. This obviously would take just a matter of seconds to hook together in a typical workflow. So hopefully this has helped you guys out. I will be making many more of these videos. Next up we'll probably start with some keying. Well, actually no, next episode is going to be animation. Animation's very important, so we'll get into animating roto shapes, transform nodes, and all things like that. That'll be the next video, so I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any suggestions for ways that would help you learn, please let me know, and as always, the files that I used in this demonstration are available in the links below, so feel free to try it out yourself. Thank you very much, guys. I hope you enjoyed this, and goodbye.